we're going to now distribute through the chat. So we have Benigno Lopez, who is our Vice President in the area of knowledge and learning at the IDB, who will be moderating. Go ahead, Benigno. Thank you, Adela. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, we would like to cordially welcome you to the third technical dialogue on trafficking in persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also are very thankful for your commitment to this initiative. The mission is really collective that allows us to combat in a comprehensive manner the crime of trafficking in persons. We'd like to also convey special thanks to all of our panelists who are going to be sharing their knowledge and experience in the cases of Argentina, Chile, Colombia, the United States, Guatemala, Paraguay, and Peru. Trafficking in persons is a violation of the rights, dignity, the lives, and integrity of all people around the world. About 40 million people are, it's estimated, are victims of trafficking in persons. In Latin America and the Caribbean, trafficking in persons affect disproportionately women and children that represent 76% of the total victims identified in the region. In addition to the terrible impact on the daily lives of these people, trafficking also has a significant economic impact that generates about $150 billion a year. This makes it the third most lucrative crime for international criminal organizations after drug trafficking and false consumer items. So increase in unemployment, as well as inequalities as a result of COVID on the one hand, and the increase of digital resources used by criminal elements are factors that are contributing to increasing the vulnerability of these populations throughout the region. Therefore, trafficking in persons is an issue that requires an urgent response with a comprehensive approach. In the face of this enormous challenge, we are launching a comprehensive agenda that is aligned with our 2025 vision relating to institutional capacity building in the justice and crime and law enforcement organizations, with a focus on actions through our working instruments with countries that include dialogues, knowledge generation, technical, financial support to countries in the region, and also generating knowledge, which is a long-term initiative. The UN is now launching the first regional forum on security and justice measures to respond to human trafficking in Latin America and the Caribbean. Additionally, the technical dialogues on trafficking in persons that began in December of last year and now is hosting its third forum today really helps us to get a better understanding of the various perspectives and has also enabled identifying jointly new innovations and multi-sectoral approaches, dealing with citizen security, coordinating and cooperating efforts with various actors that include labor markets, cybersecurity, gender, labor market strengthening. In this area, we've been through exchanges, have had various perspectives from the private sector, civil society organizations, as well as international organizations such as the ILO, as well as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the International Organization on Migrations. Without a doubt, the value added from these dialogues on human trafficking has allowed us to look at various approaches, the role of the private sector, the links with migrant exploitation and human trafficking, the opportunities posed by the digital world, and to also be able to have strong measures in order to protect victims and prosecute those involved in human trafficking, addressing the most vulnerable populations. And this is just one focus, looking at various actors that will allow us to generate effective results. So the IDB is committed to this work agenda that will launch, working hand in hand with cooperating nations, alliances between the private sector and civil society organizations, from the Vice Presidency of the IADB's Knowledge and Learning Center, we'd like to again give you our full support and wish you the best in this forum. Thank you, Benigno. And now I'd like to introduce Natalia Alvarado, who is the coordinator in the Division for Citizen Security at the IDB, who will provide us some words of introduction. Good morning and welcome, Natalia. Thank you, Adela. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to also warmly welcome our panelists who are really right now connected from many different parts of the world, looking at effective measures in addressing this scourge. So again, welcome everyone to the third technical dialogue on trafficking in persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd like to also thank Benigno Lopez, our vice president, for his support for sectors and knowledge at the IDB. So this series of dialogues really represents a space for exchanging institutional capacities in dealing with this scourge in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we do this to enable a greater understanding of the context, learning about the advances made, and identify what are the key challenges and opportunities for improvement. We know that the trafficking in persons is such a complex phenomena that requires a multi-sectoral and cross-cutting approach. We need sustainable and coordinated efforts to meet these challenges. We have incorporated in this dialogue this comprehensive approach in dealing with trafficking in persons that includes, as the vice president mentioned, responses from secure citizen security and justice organizations that are tasked with preventing and prosecuting this crime, working in coordination with labor markets as well as the immigration authorities. And we also are working in tandem with civil society organizations, as well as the private sector and other international organizations. If you just give me a few minutes to discuss some of the lessons that we have learned since we started this dialogue process in December of last year. In our first dialogue, we were able to carefully analyze the progress made with citizen security organizations and justice institutions in dealing with trafficking in persons since the signing of the Palermo Agreement in 2000, both looking at the victims who have been identified as well as the prosecutions of human traffickers that have always been a major challenge. We were also able to identify some of the challenges that affect the institutions in order to protect and prosecute human trafficking. So we've identified 5 key pillars that we need to take into account from the citizen security and justice perspective. First of all, we need to continuously training our personnel through standardized protocols. Secondly, the creation of agencies and specialized offices to deal with trafficking in persons at the prosecutor's office and law enforcement agencies. And we're going to discuss in a little more detail some of these. And thirdly, the creation of information management systems to follow up cases through entities and agencies involved in preventing, prosecuting, and enforcing the laws dealing with human trafficking, and also strengthening strategic communication, especially in those at-risk societies, and creating coordination and cooperation mechanisms in order to avoid a duplication of efforts and provide more effective responses, and at the same time recognize the role of the private sector. And in this dialogue, we also had an opportunity of familiarizing ourselves with how the private sector is seeking new innovations in preventing, assisting the victims of trafficking in persons. And we looked at some ways in which they're doing this. First of all, creating mechanisms to identify potential victims. Second, the implementation of case detection systems within their own supply chains. And thirdly, very significant, creating job opportunities for the survivors. And in the second dialogue, we began to highlight, as Vice President already indicated, a mechanism that has led to significant progress and with technology that has been deployed in order to combat human trafficking. The benefits of digital tools and the internet has made the trafficking harder to detect and more lucrative. There's no longer relevance in terms of long distances, and also we see low costs in recruiting and trading on human trafficking, and at the same time spreading these abuses. This cutting edge technology and tools are also valuable for security and justice organizations as well, in order to strengthen interagency cooperation and at the same time develop new investigation techniques to prosecute these crimes. And also looking at the migration flows, we looked at the links between exploitation of migrants and the trafficking of persons throughout the region. We've seen that in several countries, we saw some countries that were countries of origin of these illegal immigrants into countries of transit. And we're seeing more people that have fallen into these networks, and we share the concerns of the authorities in order to improve the situations of these vulnerable communities. So today we're going to address two key topics within this ecosystem of responses. First of all, we're going to discuss the importance of having specialized prosecutors in dealing with this, the complexities, and in particular, this aspect of trafficking in persons requires highly specialized teams of professionals so that we can have a greater effectiveness and to better address the needs of the victims. 9 countries in the region have specialized prosecutors' offices and units dealing with trafficking in persons. And also, we need to focus on the comprehensive approach and assistance to the victims before, during, and after the legal process. People many times will not cooperate because they're afraid of reprisals, they're afraid of the shame and rejection of their societies and their families. This is because there's a lack of adequate knowledge of these institutions that limits the opportunity to be able to address the needs of these victims in a timely fashion. And in our next dialogue, which we're going to announce the date later on, or we're going to talk about the importance of strategic communication strategies, which are essential. We're also going to talk about the link between trafficking in persons and other illicit crimes. And we always have with us our colleagues from the Division of Gender and Diversity. And hopefully we will find collective solutions to the many profound challenges that affect trafficking in person. So without further introductions, I would like to just say, let's begin, and thank you very much. Well, thank you, Nathalie. And I also wanted to mention that we already have 292 people in our audience. So that shows that this is a topic of great significance in the region, and we all need to listen carefully. For all of our participants from using the social media, we're using a hashtag trafficking in person. So we're going to begin with our first panel, which is called the Specialization for Greater Effectiveness, the Specialized Prosecutors in Dealing with Trafficking in Persons. We know how important these special prosecutors are and the uniqueness of this crime, which means that the investigative authorities need to have specialized knowledge and tools in addition to a broad experience in this crime. This is why we're going to begin with now this this panel, and we're going to have Norma, who we have the coordinator for the immigration office from the Silke. Silke is going to be our first speaker from the UNODC's Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And distinguished experts, dear participants, let me start by saying that I cannot overstate how extremely useful these technical dialogues on trafficking in persons that the Inter-American Development Bank organizes are. For us at UNODC, this provides food for thought also concerning other regions. And by its very nature, a dialogue is not to provide instructions, but by definition requires exchange and listening to each other. I really like this format. And on the issue of specialized prosecutors, I would like to mention that UNODC's last global report on trafficking in persons, launched earlier this year, recommended the establishment of specialized anti-trafficking units with multidisciplinary expertise. And based also on our work with prosecutors in different parts of the world, we feel that this is a good practice that has led to important achievements where applied. UNODC, being the guardian of the UN Trafficking in Persons Protocol, we have worked with specialized prosecutors to develop our training tools and also, for example, our case digest on evidential issues in trafficking in persons cases. It's a bit, yeah. And we have translated it actually into Spanish. It analyzed more than 130 cases to identify patterns of cases and circumstances that can either be there to strengthen a case, but very often seemingly weaken a case at court. And we have seen also that trafficking in persons is a quite complex crime, not just due to its clandestine nature, but also because it requires a constellation of circumstances to establish it. And the victim statement is often the centerpiece of investigations and prosecutions. That is a statement from the very trafficked person. I think our panelists today have quite a bit of an idea of the challenges that victim behavior can pose because of what their experience and their suffering and their exploitation has caused in them. So prosecutors need to establish trust. They need to understand the circumstances of trafficking cases and the subtle means of control that traffickers often apply. Can there be trafficking without violence? What if a victim had certain freedoms? What if there was payment? What if the victim doesn't recognize he or she had been trafficked? What if there was consent? What if the victim shows trauma bonding with the trafficker, a sort of survival mechanism? But also, what if parts of the evidence are in another country or several other countries? How can a prosecutor recognize indicators of trafficking other than through a victim statement, which should be the ideal case? There are quite a number of challenges in prosecuting trafficking in persons. And from the few points I just made, one could get a glimpse of the challenges and thus the need to specialize. For victims of trafficking, the specialization of a prosecutor may make the difference. It is the difference between spotting a case of trafficking, being able to protect victims of the crime and delivering justice, and not identifying the case and the victim and not ensuring his or her protection by not understanding and not being aware of patterns of trafficking, of victim behavior, of the evidence at hand, by not reaching out or not being able to reach out to other jurisdictions that may play a role in the case, either as country of origin or transit or destination. With this in mind, I'm happy to tell you that UNODC has become the main partner of the Ibero-American network of specialized prosecutors in trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants, Red Tram, one of the specialized networks of the Ibo-American Association of Public Prosecutors, which is composed of 21 specialized prosecutors of 21 member countries. With UNODC support, the network has created a task force to identify and prosecute human trafficking cases among mixed migration flows, another challenge. I'm sure we will hear more from the network and what it managed to achieve during the panel. At UNODC, we established a similar network in Southern Africa, a network that has also been proven really beneficial in exchanging on the specificities of trafficking cases, so as to enlighten each other or seek advice when a case seems to have reached a dead end. From such exchanges comes further specialization and an ability to recognize opportunities in a case. As a colleague of ours said, to recognize the case, in the contradictions, in the weaknesses. With this good practice model in mind, we have also provided training to prosecutors in West Africa, a network called WACAP. And then also we are planning to extend such support to the Judicial Cooperation Network for Central Asia and Southern Caucasus. Anyway, I'll stop here, and I'm really looking forward to all the upcoming interventions and hope they will be recorded in one way or another to serve as a collection of good practice. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Silke, por compartir la importancia de la trata de personas.
Thank you, Silke, for highlighting the importance of having these specialized prosecutors in the traffic of persons. And welcome to all of you to this third dialogue on trafficking in persons in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the idea is to look at the special context that would allow for the creation of these, some of the unique characteristics of the approach, some of the lessons learned, as well as challenges in terms of protecting the victims, managing digital evidence, coordinating efforts at the interagency level. And with this, we will start with our guest speakers, our outstanding guest speakers. We're going to begin with Maria Alejandro Magano, who is from Protex in Argentina. We also have Alexander Colo, who is from Guatemala and first technical secretary of the Specialized Prosecutors in dealing with human trafficking cases in Guatemala, Dominican Republic. And we also have Rosario Lopez Wong, specializing in human trafficking, working in the Specialized Office of the Prosecutor's Office in Peru, and also National Coordinator in Human Trafficking. Sandy Resino, Executive Secretary of the Secretariat Against Sexual Violence, Exploitation, and Human Trafficking in Guatemala. And Matthew Grady, Assistant Director of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit of the U.S. Department of Justice. And thank you all for accepting this kind invitation to discuss such a crucial priority and topic for the region. So now, very closely aligned with was already mentioned by Natalia, I would like to start off with the following. We ask, why is human trafficking such a complex challenge in investigations? I'd like to mention there are some aspects that make the trafficking in persons a very complex case and crime to investigate. You have a very broad profile, including local, national, transnational human traffickers that includes family members, friends associated with the victim, also looking at the link that it has with fishing, agriculture, and other sectors of the economy. And some people don't even consider themselves as victims of these crimes. Some are afraid of speaking out. Some are afraid of reprisals or in fear of even the authorities. Also, statements made by victims and witnesses vary much more than the similar testimony in any other type of crime, not just because of threats, but also because of the trauma and fear of shame faced. There's extreme vulnerability experienced by victims. By bringing forth complaints might mean that they'll never go home again. They could put their family in danger. They may lose any source of income. So victims require a variety of services in addition to housing, medical attention, repatriation to their homes. We will be discussing all of that during the panel. And just to address this and other complexities of the trafficking in persons, Natalie also mentioned that 9 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, in addition to the United States, have specialized prosecutor units to prosecute human trafficking. So what are some of the advantages of having these units? Among others, these units enable meeting with people with expertise and who are familiar with the topics to implement techniques, specialized investigation techniques, also have a much more interactive participation in building cases, including the most complex cases, provide much more effective coordination efforts at every level and working in unison with other countries through the joint investigation branches and units that will provide for a greater speed in implementing the justice system, provide harsher sentences against the wrongdoers, and reduce impunity. We need the advantage. We can see the advantages of having these specialized units. But now let's move on to a discussion with the experts who are with us this morning so that we can become familiar firsthand the challenges as well as the advances in these specialized prosecutors units. So to have a dynamic process, I ask that our speakers don't go beyond 3 minutes. We will start off then with the first round of questions. Let's start with Argentina. Welcome, Prosecutor Mangan. I would like that you would just express the institutional development efforts and the process that have fostered the creation of these special prosecutors in human trafficking and that led to the Special Prosecutor's Office to protect victims of human trafficking. Tell us how that process has unfolded and how has it gone hand in hand with the development of the Ibero-American network of specialists in human trafficking and exploitation of migrants. Go ahead.
Good morning, Norma. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to each of you. As we were just hearing in the introduction, the Public Prosecutor Specialized Office has a benefit in this complex case. In Argentina in 2008, a new law was approved on human trafficking, and it was determined that extortions and kidnappings office that was already working would be assigned a coordinated work with the prosecutors, the territorial prosecutors throughout the country from north to south, and that already had a specialized expertise in this area of these extortions with significant consequences for victims. This specialized office was also given jurisdiction over trafficking of persons cases. This allowed us to begin working on the basis of a structure that was already in place. The Specialized Prosecutors Office for Trafficking and Exploitation of Persons, PROTEX, also helps us to work with all prosecutors' offices and brings together investigations from the beginning once the complaint is made. Through the free complaint number, we received more than 1,800 complaints that are then sent and assigned to the prosecutors' offices. The PROTEX has the authority to collaborate and for over 12 years now, more than 50% of cases have involved this Protex Specialized Prosecutors Office. That's why we believe that the institutional decision to have a Specialized Prosecutors Office has been beneficial to everyone, prosecutors throughout the national territory that have to face these kinds of investigations and prosecutions. I won't go into the specificities of the difficulty. I think there'll be other questions to address that as they pertain to cases involving trafficking of persons and exploitation. But in our country, we saw that the Red Tram, as has already mentioned by Silke in her introduction, Red Tram is a specialized network that brings together 21 prosecutors' offices from our region, as well as the Iberian Peninsula, Andorra, Spain, and Portugal. This network has been in operation since 2011 and has evolved, has grown over time. In 2017, as Silke said, we have had specialized support from UNODC in terms of our annual meetings, as well as the setting up of working organs that act on 3 different areas to continue investigating the intersection between corruption, crimes, and the trafficking of persons. Secondly, to analyze migration flows in our region, and in this way determine to prevent and carry out strategic investigations in the region. And thirdly, the creation and support of joint investigation teams. In this last area, we work bilaterally or multilaterally in the creation of multi-country teams. And the network gives us the support necessary for implementing these good practices, which is very new to all of us in the network. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Prosecutor Mangano. I wanted to highlight from your comments the institutional decision to the creation of Protex that took advantage of an existing specialized office already and how that has reflected for the entire region in a positive. Good morning and welcome, Prosecutor Lopez Wong. I'd like to thank you for being with us. I'd like to begin by commenting with you on the different realities and particularities of the crime of human trafficking in Peru. For example, what is the case in the region of Madre de Dios or Puno or Lima, and how the institutional framework of the Prosecutor's Office has been adapted to those specific regional contexts. Good morning. Good morning to each of you. Thank you, Norma. I very much appreciate the Inter-American Development Bank for the opportunity to participate in this third technical dialogue on trafficking of persons. And I also thank you for your question. Unfortunately, Peru has had significant numbers of cases of trafficking of persons. Our country is recognized as an origination, transit, and destination country for trafficking of persons, and as has happened in other countries, this crisis has deepened as a result of the pandemic. To your specific question, Norma, in terms of the importance of the Specialized Prosecutor's Office, this has been very relevant in our ability to combat trafficking of persons cases. As you pointed out, specialized prosecutors in human trafficking not only are helpful in preventing these crimes and in prosecuting them, but they do not condition the participation of the victim. That is, their collaboration is not conditioned to a assistance, and assistance is able to be offered in a very humanitarian way, always focusing on the needs of the trauma victim. In terms of how this phenomenon has manifested itself in the communities in the Amazon region in our country, unfortunately, the victim situation is very vulnerable there. The situation of trafficking of persons is linked in this region, the Amazon region, Madre de Dios and other areas. It's very linked to extractive mineral operations, logging, in which traffickers are also present, and very young women, adolescent women, girls are usually victimized. In 2009, there was an operation with police, military, and Specialized Prosecutors Office. It was Mercurio was the name of that special operation. And regrettably, the traffickers that are always modifying their MOs moved to nearby regions, to an area that's known as La Pampa. The Public Prosecutor's Office that works in the area of prevention, but also in detecting timely these victims, carried out and were able to detect intelligence operations that captured the cells that organized these criminal operations, and were able to connect those with police and other agencies. It is of great concern to us that even though we know the vulnerability of victims and the fact that victims may have much more information about how they themselves could avoid being captured, the lack of public authorities' presence in these countries means that they still fall into the hands of traffickers. And I'll end my comments on this issue. Specialized Prosecutors Office are joining their efforts to private companies with the Public Prosecutor's Office to offer labor and other kinds of support for the victims so that they do not become caught in this network. There are a numbers of other offices that we are working with very positive results in this area. Thank you, Prosecutor Lopez Wong. This is a lesson also to consider the different realities of each area in addition to the scourge of the pandemic. And it's very important that we know what are related crimes, the profiles of traffickers, as well as the regional differences that may affect, as this prosecutor has already given us an example of in prevention, but also in terms of taking actions. We'll move now to Guatemala, and I give a word of welcome to Prosecutor Colop. Guatemala is a country that has become a reference in the region in terms of the institutional development for these specialized judicial organs. In this sense, I'd like to hear from you about the process that led to the creation of the Specialized Prosecutor's Office for Trafficking in Persons, which works hand in hand with your own prosecutor's office, and what are the challenges and achievements that you have faced. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you. I'd like to greet other panelists as well. In effect, in Guatemala, I think we need to understand the national context that we were living from the years 2003, 2004, where adoptions involved a lot of irregular activity. This phenomenon meant that we needed to do something to address the sale of children. It was a regrettable situation in Guatemalan society. Our children were given up irregularly for adoption, were sold, if you will, and removed from the country. This led to concern on the part of social agencies to pressure in the specialized investigation of trafficking of persons. We did not have a legal framework that would allow us to criminally prosecute people involved in these kinds of activities. But since the year 2005, we had the new reform of a law on trafficking of persons, and irregular adoption has been since then classified as a crime. We understand that trafficking in persons is a multiple offense crime. It affects not only the liberty of persons, it's considered also a sexual crime, and involves a range of activities that are criminally classified. We begin by admitting that there was social pressure in terms of needing to come up with a structure. The child protection organs of the country really collapsed. And we wanted to make sure that what had failed, which was a favoring of the needs, the particular needs of each child. And this involved civil society, lawyers, and prosecutors' offices. And this allowed us to understand from the very beginning of our origin, not only as individualized cases, but as the commission, the National Commission, is really an organized crime phenomenon. We found, obviously, a number of obstacles in that process. We were part of the Prosecutor's Office on Women. The decision was made to involve us in that unit and moved to the Prosecutor's Office on Organized Crime, having the experience from 2007 to 2012. And since 2012, we have been organized in an office just like the other prosecutors, Specialized Prosecutors Office against money laundering. We make up our own Specialized Prosecutors Office. I think the achievements are clear. It made us understand from the beginning that we can conceptualize and generalize that crimes of trafficking of persons can begin with one person, two or three people, or even transnationally involving people in other countries. Also, human trafficking can begin as a result of an investigation in financial crimes, because we were often not able to understand that we needed to follow the money route. We have in our institution now this particular view where we begin investigations looking into money laundering, drug trafficking, and trafficking in persons in a combined prism, if you will. So we wish to conclude by saying that it's been very important for us to work in Specialized Prosecutors Office. We have 16 Specialized Prosecutors Offices in Guatemala, and each one involves dozens of different crimes, and handling a crime scene of sexual exploitation is very different from a workers' exploitation case or child sex crimes scenario. So clearly, this specialization is very necessary, and that our own processes need to be respected. In our own public prosecutor's office, we have seen the clear results of having this specialized approach where we have specialized human resources, specialized professionals, and we think the opportunity to become specialized and to work continually in this way has meant much more positive results today as compared to when we began. Thank you, Prosecutor Colom. The experience of your country is in the year 2009, you were one of the only country that had specialized in the police, in the public prosecutor's office, as well as in the judiciary. Thank you, Prosecutor Colom, for sharing Guatemala's experience with us. We'll have further questions on the investigation of financial crimes and how your unit is working in that area. Attorney Recinos, thank you. We're fortunate to have you on the panel also to delve into the issue of the national coordination effort to prevent, investigate, and prosecute human trafficking. Tell us, please, what SVET, S-V-E-T, does, and with the comments that we've already heard from Prosecutor Colom, explain how your office, SVET, contributes to offering technical advice and interinstitutional coordination so that the investigations in human trafficking are carried out with a victim-centered approach. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning to all of you. Thank you to the Inter-American Development Bank for the opportunity and for this third technical dialogue on trafficking of persons. The Secretariat on Victims and Exploitation of Persons, known as SVET, is a assistance office and coordinates the efforts in our government to achieve interagency coordination, as well as with international organizations, civil society groups, and other parties. Guatemala and Central America has only our country's example, and it depends administratively on the office of the Vice President of the Republic. And we coordinate directly at the highest level of government with other ministries, secretariats, and directorates that allow us to contribute in this way with this technical assistance and to carry out coordination at the national level in a number of areas, in prevention, detention, victim assistance, and prevention at the national level of trafficking in persons. Our technical assistance office allows us also to recommend to the public prosecutor's office or the national civil police through these specialized organizations that their approach is victim-centered. That is, we want an effective prosecution and capture of those parties that are responsible for the crime, but to never leave aside the importance of attending to the needs of the victim. And I'll limit my remarks to this. Thank you, Prosecutor Vecinos. I also wanted to point out, you've mentioned a cultural approach with specific attention to the indigenous people, and we'll hope to hear from you more on that point later. Now we'll move to English.
Mr. Grady, Attorney Prosecutor Grady, thanks for being here, sharing with us the work done by the Department of Justice of the United States. The Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit has been in place for almost 15 years now. Please walk us through the history of the unit. Why and how was it created? What does the unit do? What does it coordinate actions with the federal, state, and local level, as well as the law enforcement authorities, government agencies, and non-governmental service providers?
Good morning. Thank you, Norma. And it's so great to be here with all of you today. And I'll provide a little bit of a background before I answer the question. In 2000 is when the United States passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which provides us our criminal statutes, our victim protections, and resources to address trafficking in persons in the United States. As our awareness of human trafficking grew, so did our awareness of the complexities and the difficulties of investigating and prosecuting these cases, as well as the awareness that it typically crosses state and international borders and requires interagency coordination. In short, the more we learned, the more we realized that we needed some sort of infrastructure in place to serve as a central repository for expertise in trafficking. So in 2007, the United States created the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit to serve as that central repository for best practices and to spread expertise among those who prosecute these cases. And the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit serves four primary functions. First, we will partner up and investigate cases along with partners across the United States, typically those that are novel, involving coercion, or that are complex or multi-jurisdictional. Second, we'll provide specialized trainings to law enforcement and prosecutors. Third, we'll lead interagency enforcement initiatives. And finally, we'll provide policy guidance to help strengthen our laws going forward with our legislative body. And I think the consolidation has proved highly effective. I think in the first decade since the existence of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, the number of human trafficking prosecutions at the federal level increased by more than 3 times. And as far as coordination is concerned, we do that in a number of ways. One way we do that is that our federal law enforcement bodies will notify us anytime they open up a human trafficking investigation. We'll also get direct referrals from non-governmental organizations, and we'll also monitor what is going on at the state level so that we can identify cases in the early stages and bring appropriate resources to further those cases and lead to successful investigations. And part of that is done in coordination with our partners in the field, as every federal district has a human trafficking coordinator that we coordinate with in partnership with these cases. So again, it's great to be here today, and I look forward to additional questions with this dialogue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grady. The specialization of the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit in investigating, advising on, training, and prosecuting offenses of trafficking is very valuable for the region. Seguimos entonces ahora con nuestra segunda ronda de preguntas.
We'll continue now with our second round of questions. And I remind our panelists that we would like you to only have 3 minutes for your question. Prosecutor Wong, could you now talk to us again about the cases that you mentioned. What is the support and attention to victims during the investigation of crime? Also, the protocol for accreditation that was recently issued, and how has the experience of the application of that protocol been? What have been your successes and what have been your challenges? Thank you. I'll begin, Norma, with the last part of your question. As a specialized system and as prosecutors in these very complex cases, we needed to have technical instruments that would allow us, both as prosecutors as well as professionals in forensic medicine and investigation that are part of the Public Prosecutor's Office in Peru, to specify what are the risk factors to identify vulnerabilities. In this instrument, we have classified 4 kinds of vulnerabilities for victims. We've classified them in terms of physical, psychological, and mental, and socio-cultural and anthropological vulnerabilities. And this is a characteristic of almost a majority of our victims that have been rescued and that are within our area of competence. This protocol has allowed us to use this as very useful and powerful evidence for an adult victim that, even though apparently it would appear that they have consented to their exploitation, has not in fact been the case. And this has allowed us to obtain convictions with significant penalties, thanks to the existence and the correct application of this protocol. This has allowed for cases to be prosecuted and reach convictions. In terms of the procedural approach, the Public Prosecutor's Office has assistance to victims, and in the rescue of victims, these professionals, who are psychologists, lawyers, and social workers, are present in these rescue operations. They work to accompany, to protect victims, to walk alongside them and give them the services that are needed for them to not become victims anew, to be with them when they give statements, when they're interviewed. This is a level of attention that not only seeks to end the victimization in rescue operations, but also is to give them protection for a social reinsertion. We consider in Peru that when a rescue operation for victims is carried out, it is not successful for the police and the Public Prosecutor's Office to finish just there. That is the beginning of the operation, in fact. The process of rescue and restitution of rights to the victim, well, they've never legally lost their rights, but a recognition that they have been vulnerable and their recovery of their dignity. And there's a specific level of assistance of victims as well as their families for them to have the needed support to be able to be restored, if you will, to their social context. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for sharing what success means in these cases, not only in terms of getting conviction and the coordination with police and others, but also the restitution of rights and the dignity of the victim. I would ask that we share in the chat the link to the protocol in the case of Peru. I think it'll be very important for our audience to be able to see, to be able to share the good practices and the legal instruments that have supported your work. Doubtless, the specialized prosecutors' offices have not only been possible in the way that you have described, but we need to be focused and centered on the rights of victims. I'll now move to Prosecutor Mangano again and ask her to explain to us what are the 3 axes on gender and human rights in the working plan of PROTEX. We'll hear from you now, Prosecutor Mangano. In our annual plan, there are 3 specific lines of action that allow us to organize our work best. The first of these, as Norma mentioned, has to do with a human rights focus and a gender-specific focus, as this is a crime that in more than 80% of cases in our country involves victims who are women or girls. This human rights and gender-oriented approach has allowed us to reach annual targets. We focus today our work on the economic restoration in criminal prosecutions. What does this mean? This means that we focus our investigations, our criminal investigations, on the identification of assets that are acquired through exploitation, and we seek for those assets to be part of reparations to victims as an integral part of the conviction. And we have a strict protocol on statements by victims. Parties are not able to ask victims questions directly and have to do so through a specialized psychologist who works in a very careful way with victims, with a video that ensures that we will not have to repeat those same interviews for statements a number of times. This specifically so that they don't be dependent on the victim as a means of investigation, but for that witness statement to allow them to be heard, to be present in the legal proceeding, and to not treat that statement by victims in an abusive way. This victim-centered approach allows us to also organize our assistance around the needs of the victim. And this through the Ministry of Justice Specialized Office that constantly accompanies victims from the moment that they are rescued until the final conviction and sentence is issued. We think that the chain of responsibility and authority in terms of the identification of those responsible for corruption cases that would allow these cases of human trafficking to continue. When you go up the ladder of the hierarchy and you look for convictions to the weakest levels, you are seeking to identify the significant actors in organized crime. And it's a transversal approach that identifies assets, not only to the recovery of those assets and the recovery of economic losses to the victims, but also to identify other participants in the crimes, in the organized crime aspect of trafficking of persons. And we specifically work to identify those public officials whose acts of corruption allow for these activities to continue. So we work with specialized prosecutors in the area of corruption. One of the basic premises of the Specialized Prosecutors Office is that in the end, we interact with almost all of the other specialized prosecutors' offices in our country. In this specific case, anti-corruption, but we also work with the specialized on organized crime to identify through social media networks and those in drug trafficking and drug trafficking cases, so that in those cases where the victimization and the trafficking is through the trafficking of drugs cross-border and in the use of mules, if you will, or persons who would carry drugs, we work with the Specialized Prosecutor's Office on money laundering. We always understand the need to identify the economic interests and the economic and the assets that are earned through these criminal activities.
So we were also working with the public prosecutors in the Office of Criminal Analysis so that they can generate strategic investigations and to be able to go from small cases and see exactly how these are tied to a process and how they are providing their benefits and profits, and also looking at those organizations in the prosecutor's office who can conduct analyses of assets and illegal gains. So our main pillars are of focus, of course, abide by the respect for the human rights of the victims, but it also guides our strategic aims in identifying criminal prosecutions and looking at that also in examining the perspective of organized crime. Well, thank you very much. And again, you talked about putting victims' welfare and protection at the center of this, and to focus on, again, looking at the high risks and of this crime in Argentina and in the rest of the region. We know that investigating assets is key.
For many Latin American and Caribbean victims of trafficking in persons. Could you please explain the processes of victim identification and cooperation with the origin countries in the US? Are there any special provisions and protections for foreign victims in the country, in particular from Latin America and the Caribbean, who are identified in the US?
Thank you, Norma. Yes, I think one of the critical resources we have here in the United States is our non-governmental organization partners who share a common culture and language with foreign victims. And we rely on them to gain the trust and confidence of these victims so that they feel comfortable cooperating with law enforcement. And many of these non-governmental organizations have relationships with leaders in the countries of origin, or at least have relationships with our embassies in the country of origins. As far as victim protections to foreign victims, we have two primary protections as it relates to immigration status. The first is what we call continued presence. That allows a victim to remain in the United States while an investigation is ongoing to see if trafficking has been committed against them. And there's no requirement that it be tied to any prosecution or any charges being brought, because at the very beginning, you really do not have enough information to make a decision on. And that continued presence can be granted for 1 year and is renewable. And it provides stability to the victims in the sense that they can lawfully work and live in the United States while also having access to other critical services such as medical care, housing, job skills, crisis intervention, etc. And it can also be obtained for certain family members under circumstances as well. The second protection is what's called a T visa, or trafficking visa, which permits foreign victims to remain in the United States for up to 4 years and also to adjust status to become a permanent resident. For T visas, the victim will need to cooperate in an investigation and prosecution of their trafficker, and there can also be granted derivative T visas for family members of the victims in certain circumstances as well. Thank you, Norma.
Thank you, Mr. Grady. Let's remember that the Article 6 of the Trafficking in Persons Protocol establishes the Bill of Rights of Victims of Trafficking, including some of the ones that you have precisely mentioned: right to safety, privacy, information, legal representation, compensation for damages, assistance and return. I'm going to switch now to Spanish. Continuando con este...
We will now continue with this victim-centered focus of these measures. We look at now the trafficking in children as well as adolescents. This is one of the priorities of our efforts. And could you describe exactly what specific actions are being taken in order to protect boys, girls, adolescents, and what institutions are involved and intervene in prosecuting these crimes? Yes. Well, one of the strategies that have been reinforced during my term is in this position has been working specifically with vulnerable populations that are found to be at risk in human trafficking. According to the situation in the country, we have implemented a new strategy in our national crime prevention program, working closely with the community through the various local authorities. We have also done it in those jurisdictions where our country is bordering other countries. Guatemala is one of the countries with the greatest flows of outflows and transit of immigrants, as well as people looking for support and refuge, including boys, girls, adolescents, both accompanied and unaccompanied. We have also strengthened prevention efforts. These efforts are done in a separate way, according to each jurisdiction's context, taking into account gender, cultural diversity, and ethnic diversity in the country, with human resources hired from each jurisdiction, where we work as a focus on maintaining a clear context about the vulnerabilities of each community. We are constantly looking for innovations that will allow us to identify specific sectors within the community to be better informed and prepared to deal with human trafficking. Last week, we had we actually wrote a letter, a memorandum of understanding with organizations that will enable the creation of a very dynamic process where, working with the local institutions, this will lead to disseminating information about referencing specific cases and bringing forth complaints. We have also worked with local authorities, including governors, in actively preventing these crimes, taking into account the fact that we don't need to wait until the community or the children and adolescents become victims. Instead, we are focused on actively preventing these things from happening in at-risk communities and populations. Also, this is one of the key pillars in our institutional efforts, together with the Interagency Commission on Trafficking in Persons in Guatemala. We are now updating instruments and creating programs in order to reinforce the needs and address the needs of victims of human trafficking, or looking at, as well at adult immigrants, and working together with other government institutions that includes the Attorney General's Office, the Secretariat for Social Welfare, the public prosecutors, and civil society organizations, including Children Refugees Association, and also organizations that work with survivors of human trafficking, and also mentorship programs. And with that, I conclude. Well, thank you, Sandy. We know that it's been very important that your efforts in this crucial area of Central America and the Caribbean, where we see the highest flows of adolescents and children migrants, which is about 45% of the total. Now, we also had the opportunity to talk about the trafficking in persons as a crime. And Alejandro, maybe you can look at exactly how has the public prosecutor in Guatemala, how have they been able to create multidisciplinary working groups and task forces, including digital technology? Maybe you can discuss some of the focus on investigations of child pornography and focus on protecting children. Well, in 2016, when we requested a creation of a national report as to how many cases were identified in terms of child pornography, we found 16 complaints. Now, we know that the flow and exchange of pornographic materials is much greater than that. In Guatemala, however, we did not have the investigative resources that would allow us to look at investigate ways in which children were being exploited through the internet. So we discussed the need to create a multidisciplinary task force. We needed to have computer specialists, IT personnel, and systems engineers involved. We needed to have that link between the IT people and the prosecutors, the technical analysts that can translate all the information gleaned and collected by the IT specialists to be able to translate this into actionable measures. So starting in 2016, Guatemala since then has now shifted its approach as to how to investigate online child exploitation. We work with many websites that allow us to establish these proactive investigations. And as part of the human trafficking prosecutors and investigators office, we're able to look at what's going on online. Last year, for example, as a result of the pandemic with the lockdown and with the restrictions that we saw, and in particular, the fact that adolescents and children were more online, we saw a trend, an increased trend. We saw that there were sexual predators that were taking advantage of the lockdown situation in order to intimidate children, in order to get in touch with them. And so we saw an increase and we had more complaints. So with a multidisciplinary task force, we focused efforts on investigating and prosecuting these cases in Guatemala. Now we've had more than 100 complaints a year of child exploitation online compared to the few that we had in 2016. I remember a journalist told me that as a result of the implementation of the child protection measures that we're using now, where we combine the multidisciplinary task force, we've seen an increase in the number of complaints filed. No, what we saw, what I told him was, in the past, they were being underreported. Now that we have software, we have the personnel that is trained and focused on this investigation, all of that has enabled a much clearer picture of what's really going on. And one other thing that's very important is that civil society seemed to be somewhat ignorant or detached of that. With the sentencings and prosecutions, now the community is beginning to be more aware and more complaints are being filed. In the past, and now we are getting we are getting much more proactive complaints submitted by the community. So this means that this is now on the agenda. This is a situation that is much more conscious in the community. And we now see, for example, proposed legislation. In the past, we did not have the adequate and up-to-date legislation to punish the wrongdoers. So I think one of the key changes we've seen is thanks to this multidisciplinary task force, and we were able to create this by having that support. But now with this extra ingredient, the technical IT analysts that are part of now the prosecutor's office, they're able to focus on these child exploitation measures online. So they were reinforcing the investigations that are now going on in the prosecutor's office. Thank you for that, Prosecutor Colo. During the second discussion, we saw that 160,000 children are connected to the internet for the first time every day. And as was discussed at the beginning of the pandemic, as you mentioned, there was an increase in child pornography, and this is something that we need to be taking into consideration and need to take the appropriate steps to prosecute this. So now we have time for some very brief questions, and I'm going to ask that each one of you, in fact, I'm going to ask the same question to all five panelists. And the idea here is that in this round of discussions, we're going to have you share with us, each one of you, some specific recommendations. In other words, what are some successes that you have seen in your investigations in the trafficking in persons that could be shared, success story that could be shared with other countries? We have 8 minutes to finish that panel discussion, so that I ask that maybe you devote about 2 minutes to give us some success and lesson learned that you think could be shared in other countries. And again, recommendations for the region. And we'll start off with Miss Sandy Recinos. If you could mention some success you've had with a specific program, some measure, some activity. Well, I would say from our office, we have specific recommendations. In other words, to be able to identify to create the specialized prosecutors at a regional network, working with the prosecutors, law enforcement, and the judicial branch. Having in some in some of the jurisdictions, having this specialized task force has been very effective. This includes allocating human resources, operational and tactical resources for these task forces. Another key recommendation has been that we are now reinforcing training, human resources training that has improved the proactive investigations in the country, as well as having the various sectors in the Justice Department with a specific expertise, coordinating, working with local authorities, local governors, local jurisdictions, municipal governments, even looking at working with the indigenous communities that will reinforce actions going on at the local jurisdictions. I would also like to mention that we have already held some high-level meetings where we have issued these recommendations together with technical cooperation and financial cooperation under the authority of the president, working with international organizations as well as civil society organizations to continue to work in addressing these priorities identified. I'd like to thank all of the authorities here who have supported us with these new strategies and recommendations. Through SVEC, we continue moving forward in preventing and combating trafficking in persons, protecting victims with a specialized approach and focus so that we're able to disseminate this throughout our country. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandy. Go ahead, Prosecutor Mangano. Well, 1 minute is really not enough time, but well, we'll give you 1.5 minutes. How about that? Well, I think what's most important of the measures, and especially creating these specialized prosecutors, is to, first of all, respect each area of specialization and approach. Because of our specializations, we need to work with other areas, with other expertise, dealing with the trafficking in persons. Trafficking in persons cannot be addressed just from one isolated perspective or stovepipe perspective. You have to have a multi-agency, multi-dimensional, multi-specialized approach. And I also need to highlight that in order to achieve this kind of approach, it is essential that we need to be united, interconnected in a network. We need to get to know one another. We need to be familiar with the progress made by each other and continue to reinforce the growth of these networks and look at exactly what have you been able to achieve in the daily activities in each one of these specialized areas. Thank you very much once again, and I'm more than happy to answer any other questions or respond to comments. Thank you, Prosecutor Mangano. Prosecutor Lopez, you have the floor. Thank you. Looking at criminal investigations, and I believe that the planning, well-organized actions, respecting each jurisdiction and working toward a single objective internationally, I think, as Alejandra talked about, the creation of joint investigation units. Right now, we work with in cooperation with Chile, and hopefully we will also have another joint investigation network with Colombia, so that this exchange has had a huge impact, a positive impact in investigations as well as prosecutions. We don't just go through the formal legal, international legal mechanisms, which were lengthy and took a long time to get through. Now, I recommend respectfully that we implement, that we also create these areas for we receive the victims. They're not really shelters, but we can provide counseling to these victims in accordance with international standards. And unfortunately, we don't see that in practice in many situations. This way, we're able to receive the victims and we can treat them with dignity using a multidisciplinary approach at the same time. I think that's essential. These are just some of the recommendations that I would like to share. And once again, thank you for the opportunity of having me here. Thank you, Prosecutor Lopez. And now Prosecutor Colop. Yes, thank you. I think one very important thing that is not to overwhelm the victim either. I just have the following recommendations. We believe that it's not the victim that has to be saddled with the burden of supporting the state. It's the justice institutions. Remember that the victims are very vulnerable people and are very extreme vulnerabilities. Many of them don't believe in the system. They don't believe in the institutions. In fact, they don't feel they're going to get justice. That's why it's established that those of us that make up justice institutions and government institutions need to make sure that access to the victims have access to all services, not wait for them to come. We need to reach out to them and provide everything necessary so that they can have access to redress and justice. I believe that the specialization has been a major contribution in accessing justice because prosecutors have that gender approach, they have the security and protection approach, and that has enabled victims to get that outreach. In the case of Guatemala, we have also learned it's not just law enforcement and prosecutors. Now we also have the judicial organizations that I think is very praiseworthy, that we have now specialized courts so that we can provide victims with that access. And hopefully in the future, we will see even better results. We don't want this to be just semi or partially delivered. We want everyone in their respective area make sure that victims have access to justice and redress with dignity. Thank you, Prosecutor Kolop. Mr. Grady, go ahead.
Thank you. One initiative that has worked well here in the United States is the creation of regional centers of expertise. We call them anti-trafficking coordination teams, or ACT teams, which bring together federal and state prosecutors, agents, and victim specialists in select areas to develop high-impact prosecutions as it relates to human trafficking. And I think it's this infusion of expertise and training and having a commitment by those in charge to make human trafficking a priority has unsurprisingly resulted in many more cases brought, defendants convicted, and victims recovered in those districts as compared to other districts. And you can take that a step further, as Ms. Lopez Wong talked about making that joint and bilateral, such as the initiative we have with Mexico, given that we have many victims and defendants and criminal associates that operate on both sides of the border. And so being able to share and coordinate that information with other people leads to more prosecutions in both countries. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Norma.
Thank you, Mr. Grady. 30 segundos para la licenciada Recinos que quiere compartir una cosa.
All right, we have 30 seconds for anything else you would like to add, any analysis? Hello? This is for Ms. Recinos. Yes. We can hear you. 30 seconds, please. Well, just to end by saying that from a regional perspective, we work in we work in a space that has 9 countries involved, of which we bring together efforts in order to better address regionally the measures to prosecute human traffickers. And also, I just want to add that this approach is the responsibility, a shared responsibility between the countries of origin, transit, and destination countries in the area of human trafficking. Thank you. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank all of the participants for this marvelous discussion. This has given us a very comprehensive view in the focus on the creation of special prosecutors. Having a victim-centered approach has been very clear. The advantages as well as the challenges posed by the digital world and other factors. So we are very appreciative of this coordinated effort. working with justice and security organizations and with other sectors that are key in order to providing services to victims during and after the prosecutions, as we'll see in the next panel discussion. So I'd like to thank you for having shared your experiences. This is a unique opportunity for us, for the audience, and we're very pleased to see that enthusiasm with that leadership experience. And with that, I conclude and I offer the floor to Adela. I'd like to once again thank all the panelists for having been with us during today's discussion. Thank you, Norma. And I also would just like to echo my admiration for the amazing work that you're doing. And we congratulate you for these efforts that are so urgently needed. We're going to take a very short 2-minute break before our next panel discussions. That'll give you an opportunity to have a cup of coffee. So we also would like you to fill out this brief survey in both English and Spanish, because your feedback is very important in order to make improvements on our upcoming panels. So we're going to take a quick 2-minute break before our second and last panel discussion. Thank you.
¿Listos? Bueno, muchas gracias a todos por seguir aquí entre nosotros. Tenemos 330 personas conectadas, así que les agradecemos mucho su participación. Les recuerdo que los invitamos a usar nuestro hashtag Se Trata de Personas en Twitter y en sus redes sociales y seguirnos en @bitseguridad. A continuación daremos inicio al segundo panel, protección y atención integral a las víctimas. Hablaremos sobre la importancia de la protección a víctimas
We'll
antes.
speak about the importance of the protection for victims before, during, and after, as well as integrated specialized services. The panel will be moderated by Karina, our specialist from the gender division. I'm going to present Caridad Araujo, the Chief of Gender and Diversity Division of the Inter-American Development Bank, who will give an introduction to this segment. Good morning. Thank you to our panelists that are together with us today, as well as for our audience. It's a pleasure for us to have the opportunity to talk with you today and to hear about your experiences and your best practices on such an important issue as this, and to hear about how you offer specialized assistance to victims of human trafficking. We have taken into account all of the work done within police and judicial organs and public prosecutors' offices to prosecute and prevent human trafficking. But in addition to the coordination at the national and international level, it is essential that there be a coordination with those agencies that work to assist and offer protection to victims and their families. These are the offices, these are the institutions that also derivate support to other social support, psychological support, economic support to victims so that victims may, in time, recover their place in society, recover their families, and to do so in a way that will allow them to continue to prosper and to survive. The private sector, as well as non-governmental or nonprofit organizations, play an important role in our region. They play an active role, and we understand that when we talk about integrated attention requiring the efforts of all of these actors, we're talking about a complex ecosystem of sectors, participation of service providers. What does integrated or holistic care mean in this case? What this means is putting the victim, the user of these services in the center of this ecosystem and organizing services around the needs of this person. Normally, we put services at the center of our thinking and we ask users to orient their own activities to the service provider. But here we're looking at this differently, and we want to organize services in such a way that the cost to participate, the transactional cost of participating as a victim is minimized, and that the provision of services is able to respond more effectively. We have a lot to learn still on this issue. We face many challenges in our region with the pandemic. We've seen greater levels of vulnerability, greater levels of inequality in terms of those groups where potentially there could be new victims to human trafficking. We always need to learn and bring home the lessons of best practices, both for prevention and protection of victims. We're very eager to hear from the experiences of Paraguay and Chile and international NGOs that are working with the services for detection and prevention of human trafficking. I now will give the floor to Karina Sanchez from the National Delegate Prosecutor of Paraguay. Thank you. This is Veronica Tijerina from the bank, specialist in social development from the Gender Division and Biodiversity. Thank you very much. We'll hear from Karina Sanchez from Paraguay, Fabiola Cifuentes from Chile, Rita Hernandez from Colombia, and Marcela Loaiza from Colombia. In this panel, we will delve into issues such as the relationship between government authorities and civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations to provide an adequate response, a comprehensive response to victims of trafficking, the importance of coordinating prosecution, care and assistance and protection of victims, and the importance of international coordination as well. We will have 50 minutes for this panel, so I'd like to ask our panelists to answer in no more than 3 minutes so that we can cover a maximum of topics. I'd like to start with Paraguay. In order to provide effective responses in the fight against human trafficking, Paraguay has a specialized unit in the fight against human trafficking and child sexual exploitation. Karina, I'd like to ask you, what are the key elements to provide better protection and assistance to victims of trafficking, and what obstacles and challenges does the specialized unit face in assisting survivors and victims? Good afternoon or good day. Thank you. It's very helpful to be part of this panel and to hear the way these issues have been raised in the previous panel on the need to have a victim-centered approach, principally in terms of criminal prosecution. The specialized unit as such has gone through a number of different stages and has identified a number of issues that are necessary for improving protection. We've identified the need of having specialized officers in the area of protection. These have to be professionals who are sensitive and trained with this, with these issues. And a very important aspect that has been modified throughout the pandemic is also the modification of very well-defined protocols, not only for prosecution, but also for the assistance offered to victims in the Public Prosecutor's Office of Paraguay, as well as in the other prosecutors' offices in the region. We are always concerned with the security and the safety of victims. That's a key priority for us. As a specialized unit, we will not move along in an investigation if we are not able to offer adequate protection and safety and guarantee the safety of a victim. Victims need to be aware of what risks exist for their safety. It's fundamental for us to protect a victim throughout the course of a criminal prosecution. We've also identified the need to meet these basic and immediate needs so that we have set up a system, and we see a great difference when a victim is offered immediate assistance from the point of first contact, not only in terms of being informed, but of meeting their shelter, their housing, their food needs, as well as to offer them the support of specialized professionals who can accompany them throughout the ongoing criminal process. Immediate assistance, we have noted, is extremely important. When a victim of human trafficking not only receives legal support, social support, and immediate psychological support, training for work opportunities, whatever it is that they or she needs, this has been the key for them to not be re-victimized. What we do, obviously, we need economic resources, and we've realized a need to coordinate assistance to victims. Other challenges that we have faced is sometimes the inadequate evaluation for assistance to victims. Previously, efforts to offer this assistance were not as positive and have even shown themselves to be not helpful. So coordinating assistance to victims, especially the need to offer shelters for adult males, which is something that we were lacking. We obviously need to improve training to government officials as well as to police officers, and look for other ways of documenting and offering evidence to support the criminal prosecutions that are not centered only on the victim's participation and statements. We've also seen the need to further our ability to investigate the economic crimes associated to human trafficking, the assets, identification of assets that are the result of of profiting from human trafficking, so as to be able to remunerate or to assist with victims being compensated economically. It is key. Alejandra mentioned this on the previous panel, and we've seen the need to coordinate not only the evidentiary aspect, but the protection of victims. And the challenge for us has been to strengthen our links with countries with which we have not had previously an effective coordination. Obviously, through the Red Trans Network, we have furthered our ability to cooperate internationally, as well as to offer protection to victims and assistance across borders. Very interesting to hear what some of the challenges are. What immediate assistance mechanisms are available to the specialized unit in the fight against child exploitation and trafficking of persons? We have a adapted effort, something that we've been doing informally to offer that immediate assistance. We had many challenges that we faced when offering support because we really didn't have funds. We didn't have the resources economically to offer that first immediate assistance of shelter, adequate clothing, very basic needs. That was very difficult given the constant changes that would take place in the institutions charged with offering that assistance. We sought donations from certain institutions or from some colleagues who had an opportunity to collect funds. In 2018, we formalized a project called Seed Funds, Proyecto Fondo Semilla in Spanish, where there were cases in ordinary crimes being prosecuted. Those donations were oriented to the reparations for social crimes. This is administered by our office, and with our team, the specialized unit has a specialized specific team of psychologists, social workers, and legal experts who worked directly with that group so as to put in place the immediate assistance offered to victims, and in some cases where other institutions participated, we have been able to offer immediate aid. This project closed last year, and we now continue working with an organization called Luna Nueva, New Moon, which is administering these funds and allowing us to offer this immediate assistance that is so necessary to victims because of the extreme vulnerability. They're lacking in many resources. This has meant being able to lessen some of the stress on prosecutors, because on the one hand, they need to obtain evidence. We're going to need a victim statement at some point, but if we did not even have any resources ourselves to be able to minimally ensure that the victims were given adequate shelter or that their basic needs were met, we were not able to make much progress in obtaining the evidentiary support that was needed. We hope to continue this effort for a good time to come. Thank you. I want to ask you about the approach to protection and comprehensive assistance. How does this approach differ when the victim is a minor or a female or a male? Well, it's different for children and adolescents. Obviously, they need a integrated and differentiated level of assistance and support. What we generally do is work with close family members, especially when there are victims of internal trafficking. And we work with the Ministry of Children and Adolescents in Paraguay, which has this in its jurisdiction, as well as the Public Defender's Office. Other judicial organs are involved. We are not able to offer that immediate assistance to minors. We do so in coordination with the Ministry of Children, which is charged with making sure of the protection of children and youth. And that's different because, as I've stated, we're not able to directly address these needs with these very vulnerable groups. With adult women, we work in close coordination with the technical team of the Specialized Prosecutors Office and the Ministry of Women. The team evaluates what are the immediate needs for that kind of immediate help, and as quickly as possible, we get into contact with the association Luna Nueva, as I've mentioned, which administers these funds, and they either buy or provide anything that the victim would need. That adult woman, obviously, if she did not want to go to the shelter that was being run by the Ministry of Women for a number of reasons, we are able to offer either a hotel room or another adequate place where she will be protected. That's easier when this involves adults. In coordination with, as I've said, the Ministry of Women, we offer immediate assistance as well. In the case of males, adults, we still have quite a bit to do. We have a specialized unit, and it is entirely left up to us to offer that immediate assistance. We do not have an institution that works particularly with adult males who are victims of trafficking of persons. So we do that work ourselves and offer whatever assistance is and protection is needed directly by adult males. Our hope is, and what we're working towards, is setting up a national structure, a program that would be the area in which this could be addressed. This national program should have, and we hope it would have, funds not only to fight trafficking of persons, but to assist victims. We think that would be the way to address this situation. And will allow us to have an interinstitutional coordination. I want to underscore that in our country, in Paraguay, we do not have a non-governmental organization that is specifically addressing the needs or the issues pertaining to victims of human trafficking. It is our institution, and every 5 years we see a changeover in the executive branch. So it's difficult to do coordination in regards to what has been done during the previous government. Thank you, Karina. It's very helpful for us to hear about this differentiated approach. Now we'll move to Chile. In Chile, the Intersectoral Roundtable on Trafficking in Persons is in charge of coordinating the National Act and Plan Against Trafficking in Persons in the area of prevention, victim protection, punishment and international cooperation. Fabiola, could you tell us what assistance, immediate assistance mechanisms Chile has for the protection and comprehensive care of victims? I represent more than 22 institutions in our country that make up this intersectoral roundtable for immediate support mechanisms. This intersectoral roundtable is a mechanism which allows us to offer assistance to victims independent from the complaint or the prosecution of crime. This, according to the protocol of Palermo. This offers a temporary visa that is free of charge to victims. This is one of the first mechanisms that we have available. It's important to note that Chile has just adopted a new law on migrants, and this visa has been maintained to victims of human trafficking. This mechanism allows us to offer immediate assistance and also to coordinate with other institutions through a holistic evaluation of all of the needs of a victim involving housing or shelter, but as well other services such as health and psychological support. It's important to note that in this coordination, we not only have the participation of governmental institutions, but we work with the Public Prosecutor's Office and civil society organizations. We in Chile have understood that good assistance to victims requires to have this coordination mechanism that allows us to work quickly in a timely fashion with assistance to victims of human trafficking. Thank you, Fabiola. Another important issue is the differentiated approach. In terms of this, what are the main challenges faced by the authorities in Chile in providing protection and comprehensive care to victims when we look at these groups in a differentiated fashion, women, men, and children? In terms of what I heard from our colleague in Paraguay, we have seen the need to have a specific approach for male victims of human trafficking. When we look at the case of victimization of these kinds of crimes, there's much greater visibility for the victims for teenagers and women, minors and women. And in Chile, we do have a specialized shelter for women who are victims of human trafficking, who can be helped there, who can be received there together with their children. But we do not have a similar approach or shelter for men. And in a majority of cases, we have had to look to other transitional shelters funded by the Public Prosecutor's Office or other organizations who have been able to support us. And this not only for victims of human trafficking, but also for other crimes in which males also present vulnerabilities. We have seen an increase in Chile of forced labor trafficking cases involving men. And as you are likely aware, when we detect a labor, a case of the abuse of victims of human trafficking for labor purposes, it's often the case that you can identify a large number of victims at the same time. So this differentiated approach has also involved a need to address the needs for language interpretation. We've had a number of cases with people coming from Thailand, and the access to interpreters has been very difficult. We need international cooperation and coordination to have interpreters, not only for other languages, but also for indigenous languages from Latin America. Another of the important aspects for this differentiated approach is to incorporate the intercultural dimension. The last thing I'd like to mention has to do with the fact that in Chile, with this effort at broadening what we offer to particularly vulnerable groups, we understand that migrants, women, and children have meant for us the need to be able to identify victims where we might have not traditionally thought they would exist. Amongst these vulnerable populations, we've looked to identify disabled, or people with disabilities, or people in catastrophes. You might know from the news, Chile is a country that frequently has faced cases of natural disasters, catastrophes, and this has also allowed us to work to identify possible victims of human trafficking in those circumstances. And finally, we're working with the International Labor Organization to detect cases of child labor in Chile in a joint effort on this aspect, on these kinds of cases. Thank you, Fabiola. Very important for us to underscore the different needs that each one of these cases involve, as well as to adapt services. We know that Chile has a very good protocol for attention. What are the coordination mechanisms to differentiate the kinds of assistance offered to victims of human trafficking?
Well, Veronica, as I mentioned, with the first response, and this is published in our website, I'm going to share that with you. This is a protocol that we've had since 2013, a protocol where you have various government institutions as well as civil society and international organizations. This protocol enables us to identify the services provided by these institutions, and through a coordinating authority that working with the Undersecretariat of Crime Prevention, these are also working in unison with regional coordinators that are articulating these efforts to provide as timely service as possible. This protocol, as I mentioned, has a comprehensive evaluation report that was developed jointly with these other institutions that identified minimum indicators, and they relate the requirements, needs of the victim, and the resources that they need. This report is then forwarded to the coordinator, and from there, the resources are provided. One of the first priorities is the migratory processes for victims that need it. Many of the victims decide to return to their country of origin. So the protocol, together with the Public Prosecutors Office and the International Migrations Organization, has allowed the creation of repatriation of the victims of human trafficking to their countries of origin. So the protocol is very important because it, first of all, has allowed us to sit down at the same table, listen to one another, work together from the perspective of the government, with civil society, with the coordinators at the same table, and reach agreement over what our differences are, work in an environment of respect, and that has been ongoing since 2013, where we established and built confidence and trust, and we maintain constant cooperation. I think that these have been the key for success and sustainability over time, beyond just the agreements or the bureaucrat or bureaucracy. It's essential that we maintain that sustainability in our efforts, our continuity of efforts, building confidence, trust, respect, and mutual support. in order to move forward with those protocols. Without that trust, without that cooperation, any attempt at protocol or joint efforts would not have been feasible. Thank you very much, Fabiola, for sharing that regarding the protocols established. Now I'd like to talk about the role of NGOs in assisting victims, which is, of course, crucial. So maybe, Rita, you can talk a little bit about your efforts in your area. And you need the microphone on. Rita, you're on mute. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. We're very honored to be able to be a part of this and discuss an issue that really is a passion with us. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Rescue Freedom has a model that's a little different from other international NGOs. We are an NGO characterized as working directly through these local networks where we work and seek out people and organizations that are already carrying out an excellent job in their own countries of origin, that are familiar with the context, the culture. And once we've identified these players, then we can provide financial assistance and also a follow-up in assistance, not just with the organizations, but also support the sustaining of the provide, for example, leadership training, assure that the organization is running smoothly. It's a very difficult undertaking, and all of us involved need to be cautious in frequently taking on the challenges and the workload that we face every day. It's very important that all of the local partners receive the necessary support so they can maintain that sustainable long-term effort. So having said that, I just want to talk a little bit about the model. We are now actively working in 23 countries around the world with 40 local partners identified with whom we work directly, but they do the work. Rescue Freedom does not, there are no shelters that belong to Rescue Freedom, and that's important. We work with local partners around the world. In Latin America, we are supporting local organizations in Mexico, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Belize, Venezuela, Colombia, and Argentina. And we just received the first quarter report from our partners. And through these reports, we know that 24 of the 40 local partners maintain their own special shelters for victims of human trafficking, and 62 residences that are not shelters, but they do provide opportunities and places for victims to recover and find safety, somewhat separate from shelters. During the last quarter, 338 adults were welcomed and received, including children that are in these shelters. 309 of these were confirmed victims of sexual abuse, and 38 that were suspected of being victims of sexual abuse, or exploitation, and 37 are children who are victims of human trafficking. So these are the efforts undertaken by Rescue Freedom, and I could continue talking about, and I enjoy talking about what we do. So what are some of the challenges and obstacles that you have faced in providing these services to victims? Well, that's a very important question, because I believe that, and as our colleagues have already said, Prosecutor Sanchez and Secretary Cifuentes, underscored and identified the same challenges. But now, from the perspective of the civil society organizations, we have learned quite a bit over the last 10 years. We know that in Latin America, well, we've been involved for this in this for the last 10 years and learned a great deal. And we know that laws and legislation were published starting in 2007 to 2009 on human trafficking, and they've reinforced the legislation starting in 2011. 2011, 2012 is when we really saw a real jump and expansion in providing shelters, and much more interest was generated in civil society overall. So over the years, we've received very, very crucial information that needs to be taken into account and that we cannot ignore when we're providing these services. So I think number one is that these shelters and these welcome centers for victims, they need to be specialized in just this topic in this area, because in the past we would mix victims of human trafficking with victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence victims. They would all be put together. And we realized that especially women and children who are victims of sexual exploitation, and even recently young boys who are exploited, they need to have special shelters, not just because of the nature of the crime, but also because of the trauma that these crimes have impacted on them as people as a whole. So that's why it's so important that we don't mix victims of human trafficking in other shelters with other types of victims. We need to be specialized when it comes to that and put them in specialized shelters. And also, as we've addressed the needs of these victims, we've realized the whole sequence. What are some of the after effects of the victimization inflicted on women and children, especially in the trauma suffered. And the investigations have shown us that most of the women and children impacted by these crimes carry these same type of trauma that soldiers face, the post-traumatic stress trauma that soldiers face when they return from the battlefield. So the type of attention and care that these victims need, the skills provided by personnel that address these people, these victims, not just psychological counseling, but they require specific post-trauma attention, and especially in the post-trauma recovery phases. One of the important thing that we've found is that, as my colleagues were saying, you also need, at the time that you begin the legal process, that the reality is, in order to achieve a recovery and rehabilitation and reinsertion, you need to have long-term care. It can't be 3 months or 6 months long. We know that the amount of time that these people were exploited requires that time and a half, twice as one half time as much, to provide for a complete recovery. Many of the victims come from low levels of education, and they need to also be provided that so that they can have more opportunities in the future for their own personal, professional development. So we need to empower these people so that they can become independent after their treatment. It's also important that the welcome centers and personnel also have cross-cultural skills. We receive victims from all over the world. It's not just a question of having interpreters, but you also need to have people who have been sensitized to the various cultural nuances that we're going to face. Not all cultures are going to respond the same way to the same kind of care. That's why there are many other things we could cover in this, but I'll leave it here for the next questions. Thank you very much, Rita. And if in 1 minute you could say, just tell us, how would you articulate the relationship between the government authorities, NGOs, and civil society organizations just to provide a most adequate response? Well, first of all, the importance of having these intersectoral responses, you need to include civil society organizations, as our colleague said. I'm so glad that in most countries they are integrating these dialogue forums and creating intersectoral interactions. Civil society cannot operate without the government, and the government cannot operate effectively without civil society inputs. There's not enough money to address the number of victims that we're now treating through long-term care responses. And a lot of it really depends on civil society organizations that are available and willing to do these things. And the challenge is to have and to collect the funds necessary in order to provide that care. And civil society should not just focus on rescuing these. To identify and bring forth complaints, they can do that, but the rescue itself should be up to the government. Protect that person, rescue that person, and then work together with civil society organizations in order to provide long-term care and counseling. So again, they're both closely intertwined with one another, and we need to work harmoniously that reflects cooperation, knowing that we need each other. And so that's why we need to make sure that we conduct this in a harmonious way. Thank you. And it's so important what you just said about the need for cooperation between civil society organizations, NGOs, and the government. Now, I would like to ask Marcela Loisa, what what are you doing in providing services to the victims of the trafficking, crime of trafficking? And you're on mute, Marcela. You have the microphone muted. Okay.
Good morning to each of you. Thank you. I am immensely grateful. I'm immensely grateful to the Inter-American Development Bank for this opportunity. Let me say that my voice is the voice of many victims throughout the world who would like to have the privilege and the opportunity to speak here as I do. So on behalf of all victims, I am so grateful for this opportunity. To answer your question, the foundation was born out of the need. I am a survivor of human trafficking. I was sexually exploited over the course of 18 months. And when I returned to Colombia, I saw that there were a number of gaps and needs that I had discovered over the course of my own experience, but it was difficult because of my own post-traumatic stress to appreciate all of the dimensions of this. But I understood the importance of making my own story visible. I published my first book in 2009, my second book in 2011, and through emails of many women who approached me to find out how I was able to overcome the trauma and to bring my story to light. The foundation was a response to this. We offer psychological and social support, as well as integrated social support services to families, because we understand that many victims of human trafficking are pressured by their own families to be re-victimized, or in my case, um, as victims of sexual exploitation. We want to make this crime more visible and to help people become activists. And this doesn't mean that all victims are going to be known publicly. Some would like to be able to share their story, and we want to offer support from our organization so that those people would not be re-victimized when they're not yet ready to share their testimony. So for us, it's very important that we guarantee the integrity and the respect for victims. As a foundation, we have worked to create this level of trust with governmental and non-governmental organizations because many victims continue to mistrust as a result of their experience as victims. We also want to underscore the importance of understanding this lack of resources that really restricts our ability to support victims. We'd like greater financial support to be able to work hand in hand. I am certain that our own development and ability to support victims would be greater. Really, the work of the foundation is interesting, is very important. What do you think NGOs and other civil society organizations can do? Clearly, in contributions to establish the links between NGOs, public authorities, and victims. We think it is extremely important to have a follow-up on these cases in terms of the human connections. We know of the importance of walking alongside them, of supporting them very closely because of the mistrust. And there's a lack of connection with public authorities and a lack of an ability or of a commitment on their end to believe. We feel that our role is to create stronger links, to allow victims to trust authorities more so as to be able to benefit from psychological and social support. It's very important also, we as a foundation are part of an alliance between an alliance of 14 organizations in Colombia. These 14 organizations work directly on the issue of the trafficking of persons. The director of my foundation is the executive secretary of this network, of this alliance. This means that all of the institutions, these NGOs, collaborate together in working side by side, public institutions to assist victims. We also have departmental committees where we are always trying to be present and make sure that what is needed is being done for victims, that there be territorial approaches that are victim-centered. We always want to make it clear that the crime of trafficking against persons include many different crimes. Each case is different. Each case is specific. It's very challenging to have a generalized protocol because of the different crimes and causes involved. I think that Dr. Maria Alejandra from Argentina talked about protecting the linkage between non-governmental and governmental institutions. I was a victim for 18 months and I had psychological therapy for 3 years. It took me 3 years to be able to understand the crime. First, I didn't feel that I was a victim. I felt guilt. I also was angry against institutions. I blamed others. And it took me over time, this lack of awareness of crime and of criminal activity by our own governmental institutions and in our own families as well means that it's difficult to know how to assist victims. Thank you, Marcela. Taking into account these important issues that you've mentioned to us, what do you think the tools are that an institution needs to offer integrated support for victims? Having resources is clear. When civil society organizations have resources, we can do wonders. Why do I say this way so colloquially? Because our defense of the rights of these victims, our desire for the social reinsertion, reintegration of the victim, means that we are just lacking sometimes the resources. When we support a victim, we have a follow-up, we give them a monthly stipend, we guarantee their transport. Many will say, I can't go to the meetings or I can't go to my sessions because I don't have a way to care for my children. We offer them childcare and training courses. Obviously, the protection of these victims is a responsibility of the competent authorities. The NGO is often the link for them to the prosecutor's office, the migration office. The NGOs must understand the reality of human trafficking based on the human experiences of the victims. In any language, in any jurisdiction, victims mistrust the authorities. We, as NGOs, have to build that trust and improve the relationship and the development of public prosecutor's office so that victims can benefit from their assistance. Also, to be disciplined in our ability to attend to victims' needs, to prevention, to attending to victims' needs, taking into consideration the particularities of each country and of each groups or kinds of victims. The needs are always the same, even though the circumstances are different. I think it's important for us to have sustainable development projects that would be innovative and participatory, that would work for the protection and prevention of further victimization. We've had projects with a number of universities. We didn't have funds of how we could support victims. As a survivor and activist myself, I trained the participants in these universities in exchange for scholarships or credits that victims could avail themselves of. This is an important way for us to find resources when we're lacking, find other ways to do whatever is possible and needed for victims. Another example that I can share is we went to the United States Embassy and asked for English classes for victims of human trafficking in Colombia. We wanted to support women to be trained and, over the course of our work with them, understand the experience that they had been through and to receive psychological support and find a way back into functioning within society. It's very challenging for a victim to believe in themselves and to once again participate fully in society. This is a significant post-traumatic stress. Victims do not believe in their own stories. They don't believe in themselves. And that's why it's so difficult, so challenging to rebuild and support the credibility of the institutional support. We need to go hand in hand with victims in terms of the support and to show them in their relationship with public authorities that we are able to give them a life of greater dignity and protection. More than ever, we need to understand the importance of services and mechanisms for protecting and caring, as well as coordination victims, especially the intra-institutional coordination and relationship between governments, governmental entities and NGOs, not only at the local and national level, but also regionally. I once again thank you for participating in our talk. Karina Sanchez, National Delegate Prosecutor of the Specialized Unit for trafficking in persons, to combat trafficking in persons and sexual exploitation of Paraguay. Fabiola Cifuentes from Chile's Intersectoral Roundtable on Trafficking in Persons. Rita Hernandez, Policy and Advocacy Director of Rescue Freedom in Chile, as well as our final speaker, Marcela Loaiza of Colombia, a survivor of trafficking and Director of the foundation that bears her name. We hope this conversation has not only informed you about existing services and best practices for care and protection of victims, but also hope that this will fuel the necessary conversations that needs to take place regionally. The design and implementation of effective policies for prevention, protection, prosecution, and reparations need to be based on the experiences that are already establishing what best practices are in our region. We'll close with this, our panel, and I give the floor back to you, Adela Barrio. Thank you. Thank you to each of the participants. Thank you to you, Veronica. And from here, I wish I could hug you and express my appreciation for the wonderful work that you are carrying on. We close out this third technical dialogue. To those of you who have not yet participated with your comments, your feedback, we ask you to participate using the QR codes available on the screen to help us improve our work. Thank you once again for your participation. You remained with us throughout the course of our sessions this morning. Thank you. Continue following us in social media for further iterations of our dialogue. Take care of yourselves. Thank you. Be well.